Speaker is from the Political Science Department here on campus. Dr. Justin Holmes, a Midwesterner from Illinois originally. He got his doctoral work at Minnesota. Does a lot of things around voting and behavior and that kind of aspects. I know he's a big observer of what's going on with the political scene. So he teaches an Intro to American Politics course plus upper levels in kind of those behaviors of political psychology as part of the different things that he teaches. We welcome him to enlighten us with Unit 4 and divided powers in the 21st century. So welcome, Justin.
All right, well, thanks for having me. How many people here are from UNI at some point? So you remember the old unremodeled Schindler? I was just telling the story this morning. My first class that I ever taught in here was before they had remodeled it, and I thought I was being hazed or something, because I came in and there were these like kindergarten-shaped tables and a 35mm slide projector and no multimedia, and it was just very terrifying. So anyway, it's nice to be here now that it's souped up. So today we're going to be talking about sort of some related concepts, looking over sort of what was in Unit 4. There's kind of a theme here, and basically about this sort of set of divisions that American government has and sort of what those are for. I'm going to move fairly quickly through parts of this. This is a sort of a set of topics that I spend about 6 class periods on in my intro class, and beyond that, you guys know the nuts and bolts of this stuff already. So, there will be some stuff that's very obvious, and you can kind of push me along, as need be. But what we want to think about here a little bit is sort of how the institutions that are laid out in the Constitution certainly embodies some principles. We're going to focus on this one sort of division of power principle today, and how that plays out in a couple examples of some 21st century sorts of issues. So these are things that keep coming around. So many of these concepts, they go back to the beginning. A lot of our political divisions really start in 1789 or before, and they manifest themselves in different ways every time around. So we'll have a couple sort of contemporary examples here. In general, sort of one thing I want to get across is that, any design of institutions necessitates some choices and necessitates some trade-offs. So we want to be doing sort of some thinking here about, what are some of the practical consequences of some of these decisions that have been made. As I often tell my students, there are lots of ways to do representative democracy. This is one, and not to put it down, but it's got its upsides, it's got its downsides, and any system is going to have that. So, I'd like to kind of think through that. I'm going to have kind of, as we go through this, some points where I'd like to kind of stop and, get some feedback from you guys, largely around those kinds of questions. What are some of the ramifications of this? What works, what doesn't, et cetera. There is no perfect system. Every set of rules, every set of institutions is going to have its consequences, but, we want to think about how this shapes the politics that we get now. All right, so one of the central problems or questions that the framers faced is one that's a major concern in a democracy and in democratic governance, which is basically this, what I sometimes call the Goldilocks problem, which my students don't find anywhere near as amusing as I do. One of my students a couple semesters ago said, well, it's like right-sizing. I said, oh, it's one of those horrible corporate buzzwords, but yeah, that kind of works. This idea of right-sizing government. So, dictators don't need to think about this. I mean, there's really, we don't do rights. We just, all the power goes to me. And, if you're Kim Jong-un, you're not sitting up all night thinking about how to, make these trade-offs. You're just thinking about what awful thing you're going to do tomorrow. Instead, here in a democracy, we have this sort of balancing act that we have to accomplish. And essentially, this divide is basically, how do we make a government that's both effective and not oppressive? And you guys have read through some of the Federalist Papers, I think at this point, probably read through all of them at some point in your lives. And that's a theme that pops up sort of again and again. They don't mention Goldilocks, they don't call it, right-sizing, of course. But that's this ongoing concern here, is that, how do we make this government that's not stepping on people's toes, that's not oppressive in some fashion, but at the same time is effective? And thinking about historical background a little bit here, the folks that were putting this together were really informed by sort of 2 experiences, and it's kind of striking to me that, they had lived this like in, rapid succession to when they're there. The first being, of course, fighting a war of independence against a monarchy. Clearly they don't like that. But the second experience that gets, I think, less attention sometimes is living under the Articles of Confederation, which in a technical political science sense were a complete goat rodeo, that being, one of those kind of master's level terms that you might have. If you remember the Articles of Confederation, they have, very little national government. It's basically a very loose confederation, hence the name, of these various states. They have these messy decision rules requiring unanimity or close to unanimity. And it doesn't work very well. It's basically chaotic. So, it's not quite a Hobbesian state of nature. It's not exactly anarchy, but it's a hot mess. It's not a winning combination. So these guys have these things both in mind as they're putting this system together. Essentially, we've lived through a monarchy, that wasn't any good. We've lived through the Articles of Confederation, that wasn't very good either. How do we fix that? How do we sort of thread this needle? So the American solution is sort of a two-part thing. One is that the Constitution itself, lays out some pretty specific powers that government can do. And if you go to Article 1, Section 8 and sort of look at that laundry list of things that are there, most of the enumerated things are things that the Articles of Confederation did a really lousy job of taking care of. It's just, you can kind of look at this as this is a bullet point of this is everything that's wrong with the Articles of Confederation. And there are also a couple catch-alls in there, the necessary and proper clause and, that language about the common good and whatnot, that are pretty big openings for empowering a national government. So that kind of sets that aside. The other question, though, and this is sort of a thing for a lot of the critics that needed to be answered, is, how do we keep this government from becoming too powerful? How do we keep it from being despotic? How do we keep it from devolving? And basically the solution here, I think, is a pretty neat one. And that is to avoid concentrating powers in any one person or one institution. So essentially we have sort of a two-way division here that we're going to work through here today and talk about some examples. If you guys want to throw out some other examples, that would be great too. But one is that we divide powers within the national government. This is your obvious checks and balances, your obvious separation of powers kind of stuff. The other thing is this federal system where we divide and leave some powers to the states. Compared to a lot of other countries and a lot of other democracies, the states here do a lot more. Those are units that hardly do anything. There are places in Europe where essentially they don't even have municipal elections. It's just, they're kind of, what passes for municipal government is essentially an agent of the national government. That's not at all what we get here. States matter a whole lot. In fact, as I often tell my students, you should be paying more attention to state politics and less attention to national politics because a lot of the stuff that impacts your life is what happens here. So that's kind of their way of threading this needle, this right-sizing sort of problem. Thinking about these checks and balances, first of all, Madison, you've probably all read Federalist 51, you've probably all taught Federalist 51 repeatedly, but the part of this that really I think I quite like, that enumerates the logic or illuminates the logic here, is this little quote here. But the security against gradual concentration of the several powers in the same department consists in giving those who administer each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachment of the others. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. This is really an important thing here. The idea is that we are not depending on picking good people. Essentially, this is meant to be a system that is self-regulating. In fact, this ambition, counteracting ambition, if anything, it might work better with worse people in some ways. Sort of the more ambitious, the more greedy, perhaps jerkocracy is, sort of the goal here, where they are constantly butting heads against each other, and ultimately that stops anybody from steamrolling anybody else. The other part of this is that it's meant to be a limit on government itself. So this is, a way of stopping the president from becoming a despot. That's sort of their word, more or less synonym for dictator, as I understand it. But it is also meant to keep the government from doing too much. It's, part of this right-sizing question. So we have a government that's given some powers, but then we make it kind of wobbly. It's one way to think about it. It is a kind of confusing system. It's a sort of messy system. And that is a feature, not a bug, as far as Madison goes. Thinking about the separation of powers here, just really quickly, each branch has its own job to do. That's, and this is a division my students miss occasionally, separation of powers versus checks and balances. But the idea here is that, each branch has its own job. Congress legislates, the president and the rest of the executive branch enforces. They have some discretion there. There's a fair amount of latitude in terms of, acting on Congress's intentions. And then the court essentially serves as a referee. For policies to be enacted, essentially you need, kind of the support of all three branches for that to happen, for change to happen. So, if you've been watching the healthcare thing the last couple of weeks, if you haven't been living under a rock or something for the summer, we see how hard it is even to get through step one. But making any sort of policy, any sort of change, any sort of government programs, it basically requires at least the tacit consent of all three. Congress has to do it. President has to, president of the bureaucracy puts some meat on the bones of what Congress has done. And the courts, they may keep their hands off, but that's part of it, is they at least have to not say no, to use a double negative. And so that's kind of an important part of this. If we think about kind of the American system, it's very sloppy, and there are a lot of what we call veto points, essentially places where legislation can go off the rails, and that's just the end of it. And compared to a lot of systems, we have a lot of those. Any one of these steps, and it's pretty much game over. If you've watched the Schoolhouse video, Schoolhouse Rock's video, every time Bill, has a moment of consternation, he's like, and then I could die. And he's right, he seems a little paranoid, but, Bill understands the stakes as far as that goes. Any moment, any of these things, falling out of alignment, and that's the end of the road. That's that separation of power story, essentially, is that, everybody has to get along in some capacity to make this happen. The other thing, of course, is the system of checks and balances, which are those more formal checks that the branches have over each other. And again, the distinction, perhaps I'm being a little mean by students, it's not always quite so clear what's a check and balance and what's a separation of powers. For the president, of course, the obvious one is a veto. President can, Congress can pass a law, President can say nope, and, that's potentially the end of the road. He also has the power to appoint judges, which is a number of presidents have determined over the years is not always, that powerful. You often, their lifetime appointments, you get what you get, once they've got the job. Congress, of course, they can impeach a president. They have the power to override vetoes. We don't see overrides very often because the threshold is set really, really high. Senate has the power to advise and consent on the choice of judges, sets the structure of the various federal courts. And the big one that the courts have is this power of judicial review over both of the other branches. Essentially, they can step in and Congress can pass a law and they can review it and say, no, you can't pass that law. The president can take an action, Congress can step in, and they can say, nope, can't do that. That's not the only thing that they do, but certainly that's an important part of this story too. Thinking about an arrangement like this, thinking about sort of the things here, what are some things that you guys see as sort of pluses and minuses of an arrangement that's set up like this? I have a few thoughts on this myself. But what are some things kind of in this division of power, what works about that and what doesn't? Yes, sir.
The job of government is very inefficient. It's very cumbersome and slow. I suspect the framers knew that and were okay with it. Plus, that was the lifestyle back then, too. It wasn't like today.
James Madison does not tweet. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So, part of it might be it comes from a time and a place, but yeah, this is a really slow process. The federal government's been trying to do some sort of universal health care since the Truman administration. Say what you will about the Affordable Care Act and the whatever the new abbreviation is. But, it took like 50 or 60 years of banging at that. People recognize that as an issue that maybe ought to be addressed or maybe not. But because of the system that we have, yeah, it's really hard to change anything. That's a big challenge there.
Especially when presented with immediate threat or immediate crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are, some constitutional provisions there, the ability to call Congress back into session and things like that to deal with it. But yeah, if we start squabbling, fortunately in times of war and whatnot, we usually come together. But, if say after Pearl Harbor, if the normal political process had played out, this isn't a great system for dealing with that. Fortunately, everybody said, okay, this is a problem, and, we need to deal with it. But yeah, you could have Congress drag its feet or, veto whatever, and yeah, that would definitely be a concern. So it's not real light on its feet, would be kind of another way to think of that. Other things that work, don't work, potentially problems or challenges for an arrangement like this? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's important to kind of look at that context there of, I like that this last 12 years is especially kind of unpleasant that way. There's a book that I like when I teach my honors sections. It's a little much for the non-honor sections, but it's called It's Even Worse Than It Looks. It's by Norm Ornstein and I forget the other guy's name, Thomas Mann, I think, basically looking at these questions of gridlock. And yeah, their contention is that, partisanship is part of the difficulty here. This is a system that was put together before parties. Something that always blows my students' minds. They just think, parties are just a thing that were always there. Well, parties weren't a thing that was always there. And that's kind of Mann and Ornstein's big concern here, is that as the parties have gotten more polarized, as they have less of that, let's go have a cigar and a bourbon and settle this, in the back, kind of attitude, this system doesn't play nice with that. It doesn't play nice with strongly ideological parties. And so, yeah, maybe this gets worse. We only have kind of major legislation come around during periods of unified government, is often the case. Maybe that's a problem, as far as these things go. Other stuff. Ups, downs. Yeah, that's and the Constitution itself, it's a strength and a weakness, but man, the whole thing is pretty vague. Oftentimes, I look to it and say, man, I would kill for an asterisk right here and a definition down in a footnote somewhere. And on some level, that's kind of helpful. We don't have to amend the Constitution every time a new arrangement comes around. But man, there are all kinds of things left undefined, and I think you're absolutely right in terms of who can do which of these things. We have some new stuff that's come along that we'll talk about in a minute that's just not clear. It's just not clear from going back to the actual text itself. If you've ever looked at like actual legislation kind of stuff, statutory stuff at the state or federal level, they spent all this time on definitions. I used to bake bread for a farmer's market, and I decided to do it by the book. So I went to the state, law about farmers markets. And they spend more time defining what is a hazardous and a non-hazardous baked good. Probably none of you are aware that there are such things as hazardous baked goods. They spend more time on that definition than the Constitution spends defining anything. Cream pies, essentially, that require refrigeration are hazardous, just in case anybody was worried about what those things might be. But, it's like 2 or 3 paragraphs distinguishing various baked goods and who can sell what at a farmer's market. But say interstate commerce, that's a big deal. It's there. Oh, and with the, Indian tribes, that's tacked onto it. That's as much explanation as you get for stuff. So that's a real challenge. That's going to be a challenge that we'll talk about a couple times in here. Because, yeah, it's not always clear whose job something is, or this new issue, what kind of thing is it? There are even cases, as we'll talk about in a minute, where you have 2 conflicting federal statutes, both of which are probably okay, and both of which push you in different directions, essentially tell you to do different things in some concrete situation. And we don't always have great ways to resolve that, so that's absolutely a challenge here. Any other thoughts? Sure.
As all things being equal, it's done a pretty remarkable job at preserving liberty.
Yeah. Absolutely. We have some amendments to the Constitution, but man, the fundamentals are still there. And for the most part, it's set up a system that's really robust. Again, we look to other countries and, they've had all kinds of turnover, all kinds of changes. The French write a new constitution about as often as I change socks, it seems like. Okay, I changed socks a little more than that. But at any rate, our basic framework here, with some important caveats, of course, but with some, it's been stable. So that kind of Madisonian equilibrium, self-regulating kind of system has largely functioned, and I think that's I was noticing, the list I have in a second has a lot more negatives than positives, but that's a big positive right there. We're going on, 220 some odd years, 230 some odd years now, of roughly similar government, with, again, tweaks around the edges, of course, and not a lot of other places can say that. So on some level, this is a pretty workable system. It does, despite whatever flaws it has, it's largely, it hasn't devolved into dictatorship as much as people like to paint presidents that they don't like as dictators. So far we haven't, we survived any number of iffy people, in the system over the years. And so it is strongly robust in a lot of ways. So I think that has some real value there. And I'm glad that you made that point because, for whatever other flaws it has, man, there is some stability here and it does really kind of do its job. So on some level, they get it pretty right. Any other thoughts? I've got a few, of course. But, well, it is the magic number if we're going to keep it in the Schoolhouse Rock vein. So. And as a political scientist, I'm supposed to like the other one, but that's a catchier song, I think. So. Well, hey, that's a good thought. Yeah.
It's a great foundation. If they had 2, it would have been balance
between 2, but yeah, the 3 they can kind of gang up on each other. Yeah. It's kind of like being like when I was in college, it was always, the hell situation was having 3 people sharing an apartment because that was when things kind of tended to devolve. But maybe for a system like that doesn't involve doing the dishes, this is, kind of the ideal way to balance things out. All right. So some pluses here. Well, again, the first 2 points, we've pretty much already made. It is pretty effective. Again, that stability thing and that self-regulation has been quite impressive, to my mind. We don't have, well, setting aside the whole Civil War thing, we generally don't have, coups and bloody revolutions and things like that, since things have gone into place. That is a giant caveat there, of course. The other thing here is that perhaps, slower change isn't entirely such a bad idea. This idea that we don't want to be bouncing back and forth with policies all the time. There are, for any number of reasons, kind of incrementalism isn't a horrible idea. I hear that a lot from some of my more liberal friends anymore that, incrementalism is the enemy. On the other hand, gosh, if every time we have an election we chuck all of our policies and go in the opposite direction and whatnot, that's a disaster, in a lot of ways. That's not effective. It's bad for, business. It's bad for rights. It's bad for all kinds of things. This slowness might be an advantage, in some situations. Now, I'm not going to say it's an advantage in all situations. As far as limits and some downsides here, a lot of this is conditioned on partisanship, which, again, as I mentioned a second ago, was not something they had really anticipated. I mean, I think that's where I think, if they whiffed on anything sort of in this design or in kind of this period, not having that understanding, and I do take Madison to task for this a little bit, he thought, there won't be permanent factions, and then he goes on to found a political party in part. So, I think the system doesn't play entirely well with that. So, again, on the one hand, we have, gridlock when government's divided. On the other hand, maybe some of these checks and balances break down when government's not divided. Now I'm just being cynical. You're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. But certainly, especially if you're the out party at any given time, it's not comfortable to live with, united partisanship of the other side, controlling, all branches of government. Because maybe they don't check each other. Certainly that's been sort of a story, a lot of folks, I don't know if you've heard this, but, a lot of folks don't like President Trump a whole lot. And, just in case you were unaware, aren't you glad you came today? This is totally worth the price of admission. But, one of the challenges here, given that he controls both houses of Congress, in terms of the Republicans control both houses of Congress and have a majority on the Supreme Court at this point, I have a lot of, every day there's some new column. It's like, has Trump finally committed an impeachable offense? And the short answer is typically, so long as Republicans have, more than, Democrats don't have 67 votes in the Senate, no, he hasn't. That's kind of the bottom line here, is that, we don't have a lot of checks. And Republicans would say the same thing about Obama, is that, well, nobody stepped in and stopped him from doing X, at least until, Ted Kennedy died. And then, you have the filibuster, the ability to block filibusters, or to filibuster again, I'm sorry. Hard to get things done. A couple other things here. There are some new things that have shifted over time that shake this traditional story up a little bit. When we add new structures into things, just kind of the practicalities of governing in the 20th and 21st centuries really do sort of upend elements of this. So one thing would be, the bureaucracy. We have these executive branch departments. And you have to have some of those. I mean, people always hate bureaucracy, but my mom's a bureaucrat, so I think they're okay. And I like my mom, so at any rate, the bureaucracy does sort of upend this because, their function sort of blends elements of all three of these branches. They are making policy. Oftentimes Congress will sort of defer to them, and they're making rules. They're enforcing rules as an executive branch sort of agency would. They're also handing down judgments at times. I mean, they can't throw people in jail, but they are, handing down monetary judgments. I mean, they're functioning as all three. That upends some of this story because the bureaucracy, post-New Deal has gotten a lot bigger. It's doing a lot more things. And that may send us out of equilibrium a little bit. That's a potential change. The other thing here, and this is one that's gotten a lot of attention lately, is the concept of the executive order. That's not anywhere in this system. That wasn't on our list of, standard checks and balances. It's not an unconstitutional thing. It's just sort of more of an extra constitutional thing is my take on it. It doesn't exist in the Constitution, but it derives from that idea of the executive authority being invested in the president. That shakes things up too, a little bit. For presidents to be able to sort of take these unilateral actions. As Obama said, sort of famously, I got a phone, I got a pen, I'm going to make stuff happen. That's one way around this gridlock problem. Essentially, if the other party won't pass any of your stuff, well, you do as much as you can through executive action. There are some real limits to that. I'm actually not somebody that's so fired up about these as being a giant problem, but some people have floated this as a problem to the constitutional order. There are some real limits. One is that they do expire, or can be easily overdone. If one president can do it, the next one can undo it. My favorite being the Mexico City rule about funding abortions, or funding non-abortion services from foreign abortion providers. So there's kind of this gap here in the federal law about whether these folks get money or not. President Reagan says they don't. President H.W. Bush says they don't. Clinton says they do. Bush 43 says they don't. Obama says they do. Trump says they don't. And that's something that literally all of them on like the first week in office have changed. So it's not a great way to make policy, if you're a president. It does show some of the limits there. That thing, I quit. I was doing my fingers and then I lost track. But at any rate, in my lifetime, that policy has flipped 5 or 6 times by executive order. So that's a real limit there. There are also, if we look at sort of the content of these things, you can't really do anything that contravenes what Congress has already done. You're basically kind of working in the gray areas. So, if you remember back to, after the Newtown shootings, Obama had 27 executive orders on guns, and the NRA put everybody on blast, and, oh my gosh. It didn't confiscate anybody's guns. It didn't overturn the Second Amendment. 3 or 4 of them were basically notes to executive agencies that were like, do the job that you already have. One of those being like, update the mental health database. That's something you're supposed to be doing anyway. So, and that's been the case with a lot of Trump stuff too, to be fair, is that, liberals get really bent out of shape about some of these executive orders. A lot of them don't do very much. They are sort of as much statement of principle as anything. The religious liberty one, for example, with kind of the IRS directive about politicking in church. Yeah, it's a change in policy, but that law has never been enforced as long as it's been on the books. So that's not exactly a giant change. You can't kill, the Affordable Care Act through an executive order. You couldn't will it into existence through an executive order. So these are sort of limited here. A couple other things here. The checks and balances themselves are kind of blunt instruments. If you think about sort of what these checks are, the veto is not ideal. Richard Neustadt was a kind of prominent 50s and 60s political scientist, scholar of the presidency, and said, this is actually a failing. It's not an exercise of presidential power. If the president ever gets to the point where he's got to veto something, it actually means he screwed up. Not his exact words, but, that's the sentiment there. He should have been able to persuade Congress to get something that he could live with, is sort of the goal there. But this is really, we don't have line item vetoes at the federal level, so it's kill the whole thing or take the whole thing. That's not a great check. That's a real blunt sort of instrument. Same, frankly, for checks over the executive branch. Apart from impeachment, there's not a whole lot there, at least in terms of sort of the basic constitutional system. Back when Congress failed to impeach President Clinton, they did issue a censure, and there was some question, do they even have the power to do that? Which, in the end, it's sort of a sternly worded letter, is about all that does. But there was some question, we could have impeached him, but can we say you did a naughty thing and we don't like it? I don't know. And that's a real challenge here as well, is that these are not real nuanced kind of things. You can kick out a president. We don't really do that because, that's a pretty over-the-top kind of solution to things. A veto, frankly, is a pretty over-the-top solution, to things in a lot of cases. So that's a real challenge there. The last thing here, and this is one that's come up a lot in kind of the last 6 months or so, is that, a lot of this does deal with tradition and deference. The Constitution, this is a horrible thing to say, but, it's a piece of paper in the end. It doesn't have any power on its own. It depends on people recognizing its power and actively, participating in such a way as to do it. And there are some real questions, what happens if someone decides to step out of line with the Constitution, step out of line with the powers and the checks and whatnot? What do you have? The courts in particular are pretty weak. There have been a number of presidents, Jackson sort of most famously, who said, Supreme Court's made their decision, let's see him come enforce it. And, other presidents have said things not quite as blunt, but in that same genre. It's not like they're going to throw the president in jail for contempt or something like that. So, there is a lot of why this works is that you do have this idea that, I respect the process, I respect the institution. What happens if you get players that don't? And we have had moments where we have had players that don't. Lincoln, of all people, comes in as the greatest of presidents on, most lists. One of the things that really honked off Congress was that they gave him a military budget for the Civil War and an X number of troops. So, yeah, whatever. Spent more, got more troops, et cetera. What are they going to do at that point? There's not a lot of control there. So that's sort of a concern as well, is that we're depending on sort of all the actors playing within the rules, and you don't always get that. Most of the time they do, but from time to time you're going to get somebody that doesn't. All right, in practice, let's talk about the travel ban a little bit. Again, if you've been not living under the rock for the last 6 months or so, you're aware of this basic situation, but it puts a lot of these things into focus here. For the two examples I've got today, I'd like to hear some of your input on these things, but I don't really want to talk about sort of the merits as policy. I want to think about these more in terms of sort of government power and whatnot. Think about it kind of like the Supreme Court. John Roberts had a great line in the healthcare decision. I don't have the exact verbatim quote, but it's basically, we're not here to decide if this is good policy or not, which is kind of I think this sucks, was his answer there. But we're here to decide whether government has the power to do this or not. So thinking about how this applies in a real life situation here. Article 1, Section 8 gives Congress the authority over immigration and naturalization procedures. That's actually something that's been repeatedly misstated in the press, and I hear this a lot when I fight with people in the internet comments, which you should never do. But when I do, it's like, well, no, that's not actually a presidential power. That's something that's a congressional power. But in the 1960s, there are two laws that were enacted that basically come into play in terms of dealing with how we deal with the situation now. So one of them, and the one that the president likes to point to quite often, is that there was a law passed that basically delegated the president the authority to block certain people or certain groups from entering the country on security grounds. And frankly, the Congress has delegated a lot of enforcement authority over this area of immigration and citizenship and things like that. A lot of that has been delegated over the years to the executive branch. There's a second thing here, though, that gets less attention that was passed a year later, and that is a ban on quotas from country of origin. So we used to have these really rigid quota systems dealing with immigration. There was the Chinese Exclusion Act that for, X number of years nobody from China could immigrate. And we had, kind of quotas from each country. They did away with that. Well, these two things are in tension with each other, of course. On the one hand, the president has a lot of latitude to act. On the other hand, banning people immigrating from 7 countries, well, that would be essentially a quota of 0. Well, that presents us a challenge. Beyond that, there are potential First Amendment issues here as well. The ban, as written, does not mention religion explicitly, doesn't mention it at all, but of course it's worth noting that these are 7 predominantly Muslim countries. And on the campaign trail, he basically said, we're going to stop Muslim immigration from happening until we figure out what's going on. Again, don't say things like that in public if you think you're going in front of the courts. At any rate, I can't speak to that. I've done a little reading, on that topic, and certainly constitutional law people who know more about civil liberties are more divided, very divided, in fact, about what kind of First Amendment claim somebody who doesn't actually live here might have. But what's interesting here to me is sort of how this, again, intersects with this sort of 3 chunks of government business. He implements it via executive order. That's not uncommon. Presidents have taken immigration action. President Obama took immigration action, by executive order. That's not unusual. Immediately, as you may recall, the courts step in and stop implementation, both of Travel Ban Version 1 and Travel Ban Version 2. And the Trump administration, basically his lawyers make this argument that I think is a pretty not good argument, basically say, well, look, executive actions on immigration are beyond beyond judicial review. Good luck with that. One, just as a matter of going to court, the first thing you should probably not do is tell the court, oh, you don't get to decide this. Just as a matter of interpersonal psychology, that's a terrible way to win friends and influence people. But beyond that, as a matter of constitutional principles, none of this is beyond judicial review. They may uphold them, they may not, as far as sort of the merits of the policy go. And again, I'm not an expert on, where this is going. And frankly, the courts have gone in different directions. But every single court that's had this in front of them has said, no, in fact, we do have the power to review this, and by the way, we're going to put it on hold. Just this last week, the Supreme Court is now taking it up in the fall. They may uphold it. They may, they kind of undid a portion of the stays. So again, this could go either way. But it does show what this system looks like in practice. Essentially, President's Act, Congress can give presidents authority, but at the same time, none of that is above judicial review. I'm probably going to get angry tweets this afternoon or something like that. But at any rate, so that's kind of one place, ripped from the headlines, that this very much comes into play. Thoughts in terms of the power in that situation? How does this? What do you guys think about how this might intersect with, some of these principles that we've talked about?
When you were talking about the slow pace of it, when we were talking about the pluses, isn't the fact that our society, technology, internet, everything moving at such a fast pace that we should move faster to make sure that we have that we can take care of these things before they basically become obsolete? Because with the stay of the travel ban, it's a 90-day travel ban, so it's going to be over by the time they probably hear it in October. So you're just like, okay.
Well, that's I've seen some speculation that's how the court may deal with this, is just not answering, because they said, oh, you said it was a 90-day ban. It's been 9 months. Whatever the judicial equivalent of is potentially what the answer might be, is that they may just punt, on the matter. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The court that's actually a very fast court action to have, potentially a decision within a year. But yeah, the slowness. On the other hand, say if we take seriously, and I'm not saying you need to take seriously, but if we take seriously the idea that we need somebody that can stop threats, well, potentially this is something where you want somebody to have a little more latitude. That's something where empowering the executive branch would maybe have some value, and not hashing this out forever. Basically the courts have not seen this as a threat of that nature up to this point. But you can also fathom, that's a reason that you might want a strong executive, is to do things like this. If there were hypothetically, a terrorist attack from a Syrian refugee or something like that, that might be a whole other story, at this point. And having somebody that can move quickly might make sense. Now, again, these are all very hypotheticals, and, but yeah, I think this very much, the pace of things very much feeds into this. Other thoughts on this one in terms of, who should have the power to do this, or how these checks ought to work?
Is there any thought that Congress, a court case could see that Congress doesn't have the authority to delegate anything to the executive?
There have been some questions about that, yeah, and it comes up in some of the bureaucratic stuff sometimes. The ins and outs of some of the con law stuff, not exactly my forte. But that has been an issue that's been raised, say around like CO2 emissions in the EPA. A lot of EPA stuff, Congress will basically say, you have the authority to regulate X, you guys develop the standards. And that, again, gets constitutionally messier. That basic story that we're telling is that Congress passes a law and, the executive branch enforces it. And they say, well, we want you to regulate how much arsenic goes in the drinking water. You come up with a rule, is sort of the thing. So yeah, I think that's a definite challenge here too in a situation like this is, how much can we delegate, actually one case I can tell you where the court stepped in, Congress gave the president a line item veto, which essentially is a delegation of legislative authority, is one way to think of it. That's what the courts thought of it, and they said, no, you can't do that. So, yeah, I guess that would be, now that my hamster wheel in the head is spinning for a second, I think that's actually a pretty clear example of a time that the courts have stepped in and said, no, there are some powers that you can't delegate to the president. So.
That's pretty clear.
Yeah.
Clearer.
Especially because we have 200 years of precedent that we don't do that. Right. Well, and that's kind of the challenge, is often who has standing for these things. That's one of the challenges with the Supreme Court, is that in so many of these cases you need somebody that has an actual claim of harm. And for so many of these things, finding, that's, I think, the limit on the system, is that, how can you even get a challenge to the referees sometimes? So that is a definite limitation there. All right, the other thing we're going to, do I have that in there twice? I think I do. All right. Oh, I'm going backwards. That's my problem. All right. So the other division that we have here that we'll spend a few minutes on and come up with another example here in a second is this division of federalism. So again, compared to lots of other countries, we kick a lot more back to the states. They have a lot more autonomy than the national government does. Now again, just to stipulate kind of one of the challenges here off the bat, which is kind of in line with what you had said a minute ago, this is not an area that's real well specified constitutionally. We talk about national powers, talk about state powers, talk about concurrent powers. There's a lot of stuff that, we don't have a good way of determining whose job is what. The clear national powers are things like defense. We don't want to let Minnesota declare war on Canada, for example. That would be problematic. We don't want states declaring war on each other. So we have, some certain checks there. Coining and regulating money, again, there's a sensible reason to keep that at a national level. Things like conducting foreign relations. We have certainly, governors that will make trade visits and things like that, but they're not able to set national trade policy or anything like that. It's more, hey, come to Iowa, we've got pigs and soybeans, and it would be great. Those are some clear things. A lot of your standard public safety stuff really is state-level things, and Madison and kind of Federalists 45 and 46 really kind of gets at that, is that a lot of the business of governance, in their sense, was going to happen at the state and local level, much as it had up to that point. For so many of the laws that govern our day-to-day existence, it's not federal stuff, it's state stuff, local stuff, etc. Of course, in confusing ways, sitting here, you're under the auspices of about 5 or 6 different governing units, at any given time, which does set up some challenges. There are, of course, those concurrent powers that both of them can do as well. Things like taxes, have courts, etc. Thinking here about the historical context, just briefly, probably as they're coming together to write a constitution, they don't really have any choice but to leave a lot to the states. I mean, these are delegates that are from the states. You have 13 states that up to that point are sort of semi-autonomous little things. The Articles of Confederation didn't put much meat on the bones of a national government. It's essentially a defense pact in a lot of ways. There's just not a lot going on at that national level. And I would imagine that probably if they had come forth with this new constitution and said, we're just going to dissolve all the states and start over again, that would have probably been met with kind of a two-fingered salute, assuming that's how you address those things back then. The Constitution itself is not particularly strongly states' rights. This is something that I hear periodically from people, and I just kind of smack my head. If anything, sort of in the historical context, this is a big push toward centralization. And frankly, people like Madison and Hamilton and whatnot were fairly upfront about that. I mean, their thinking was that, look, these great nations, these other great nations, they have strong central governments that, have a fair amount of power. That's how you get to be France. That's how you get to be England. Nobody powerful is doing what we're doing right now. And the Constitution itself, it doesn't have a lot of carve-outs. It doesn't say, states get to do this and states get to do that. It's mostly about the national government gets to do all of these various things. That said, of course, they had some real expectations here that a lot of governing would happen at the state and local level, and they expected, frankly, that the states would keep the national government in check. I mean, they had this notion that, well, these folks have militias. If the national government gets out of control, have them help them. Again, not quite in so many words, but that's largely the spirit of several of the writings here. So again, there is this sort of expectation that a lot of stuff will happen locally. And for what it's worth, as compared to what we have now, the federal government is very weak, in its early forms. We have had a real shift of power to the national level. Although even at that, the states have an awful lot of ability to make their own policies. That's certainly something to think about. 10th Amendment is kind of your other moment that talks about what the states can do. And this is one that is always misread. Always misread. And it's a terrible sentence. If you go back to like 7th grade and try to diagram this thing, good luck. It's got, pronouns that don't refer to things and, blah, blah, blah. But every so often, some state senator, probably from Texas, says something like, well, we have veto power over the national government because of this 10th Amendment. And I just shake my head and cry and die a little inside. What the 10th Amendment says, I've got the text here, I'm not even going to read it to you, but basically what the 10th Amendment says is, look, if the Constitution says the federal government can do it, the states can't do it. That's actually a limit. That's not an empowering of the states. That's a limit. We saw that in the Arizona SB 1070 case in front of the courts, where Arizona tried to enforce stricter immigration rules, and basically the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. Basically, by the 10th Amendment. Article 1 gives the federal government the power to regulate immigration. Because they're doing it, this says you can't. Now, 3 justices didn't agree with that, but, that was their finding. So the idea here is that, look, what the states can do, they can do things that are not federal jobs, and they can do things that the Constitution hasn't told them they can't do. Again, this is messy. Even that's not a great explication. That doesn't totally clarify this. But basically, what the 10th Amendment is telling them, if the federal government's not doing it and the Constitution doesn't say that you can't, so bills of attainder, ex post facto laws, things like that, then I guess you can. And the idea here was basically to not have a power vacuum. If we put this into effect, what happens when we don't have federal laws against murder on day one and things like that. Essentially, the idea is to have some continuity with the governments before. Thinking about some pluses and minuses of this arrangement. What are some things here, some issues that come up with this, some things that are maybe advantages? Yes, ma'am.
So when California says they're going to stay in the global climate board, even though Trump's going to pull the United States out, are they engaging in foreign relations?
That's a great question, as well as various cities and things like that. Yeah, technically, no. I mean, they can't join the Paris Accords. That would be a violation of any number of sort of constitutional principles. That said, to the degree that they can make environmental policy, I think what they're really saying is that we're going to stick with the policies that we would have stuck with, because I have to think that, although I can't promise, but I'd have to think that most of them would realize, the state of California doesn't get to, go to France and make foreign policy. Yeah, I think that's a challenge right there, is that we do have moments where states want to step in and do foreign stuff. What about tax breaks, for example, for foreign countries at the state level? I mean, I guess you can do that, but on some level, does that sort of step on the powers of the national government, in doing trade? To the degree that you could give those tax breaks to anybody, probably not. But yeah, and I think what this highlights is there's a lot of ambiguity here. Who can do what? I'm kind of with the spirit of your question. There's no way in hell that the state of California can join the Paris climate agreements, whether or not you think that's a good thing or not. But they could probably stick with their own CO2 limits, in line with what had already been proposed, would be my suspicion. Governor Moonbeam might not, that's a possibility. Yeah, and again, I don't know about some of these mayors and whatnot, that have sort of signed on for the same thing. But yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right, is that, they can't be, as much as anything, yeah. I mean, it's a way of voicing a complaint and, maybe some virtue signaling or something, but they're not going to be able to make binding commitments, on behalf of really anybody, in that kind of context. But yeah, that's a great example of kind of where this gets messy, in a hurry. Other things, other thoughts, pluses, minuses, challenges?
I got a question. Well, okay.
Yeah.
I always, maybe you can help explain this. I know it's not stated in the Constitution, but in most places in the United States, it's illegal to have marijuana. And all of a sudden, you have states that are passing marijuana laws.
Let's stick around for 3 slides down the road.
Oh, okay.
Yes, because that's to my mind, that might be sort of the clearest example of challenges that a system like this sets up. Absolutely. You want to come lead? You can. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Pluses, minuses. Mm-hmm.
Some states were not going to enforce 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. Also, at the same time, some states were lowering drinking age to 18 to 19.
Yep.
And essentially, the Reagan administration said you're going to change those things to 21, which is probably a good idea.
Now that I'm over 21, I agree with you. Yeah.
But the federal government actually withholding federal highway funds.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and that happens a lot, and the court has ruled on that. There's actually South Dakota sued the federal government over the drinking age, of all things, it's a lot of stuff around alcohol, a lot of stuff around education are kind of 2 areas where that sort of mechanism has come into play. I was living in Minnesota back when I was in grad school, and there was the push to lower the drunk driving limits from .10 to .08. Minnesota and Wisconsin were the last 2 handouts. holdouts, or last two holdouts. Wisconsin because they have a long tradition of drinking lots and lots, and Minnesota because basically they were afraid of losing business to the bars on the border. And so, if Wisconsin's not going to change, we don't want to change. And that's exactly what happened again, is basically, the federal government said, a chunk of your highway money, if you're willing to forego that kind of money, well, good luck. The court standards have basically been, if it's not an amount that is, if there's a legitimate choice, and it can't be typically all or nothing is the other thing. So it wasn't all their highway money in these cases, but, it was a portion. One area where actually states did, or some school districts at least backed out, was the school lunch program. Was implemented in the pretty much the same way. So, the FDA, there's nothing in the Constitution about education one way or the other. And so, largely things like No Child Left Behind, et cetera, are largely, your funding from the federal government for your schools is contingent on doing X. With No Child Left Behind, 2 states actually threatened to just skip federal funding and not sign on. And ultimately they said, wow, that's a lot of money, I'm not going to do that. But with the school lunches, there were several districts, it wasn't many, but several, that said, yeah, we're not going to do these school lunch standards, we'll just, lunch is $4 now. And, they can do that, essentially. So, but yeah, that is kind of one of these things, if the federal government, and again, depending on your perspective here about states' rights, this is a good thing or a bad thing, but, if we want to kind of compel uniformity, what tools does the federal government have? Oh, yeah. Yeah. You'd be forever in Montana, yeah.
What about the idea of Trump threatening to hold money back from sanctuary cities?
Yeah, good luck with that.
There's no way.
There's a couple problems with that. So one, he's threatening basically all money, which, that was part of the South Dakota Supreme Court decision was that, well, part of why this is okay is it wasn't all your money, it was just part of your money, so it's not sort of unduly coercive, vague legal standard that is. The other thing is that there is no line item for, federal money for San Francisco. Essentially you would have to go through, if you're going to do that, you'd have to go through and defund, not just for each city, but you would have to defund for thousands of programs. We're looking at HUD, we're looking at WIC, we're looking at, just any, highway money, road construction. There's just a practical matter. There's no real way to do it. It's not like you can just flip a switch and say, oh, nope, Chicago, you don't get money anymore. You would have to go through and actually defund every single one of those programs. And most thought that I've seen is that would not, a complete defunding, apart from the practical matters of it, a complete defunding wouldn't pass constitutional muster either for the courts. They wouldn't get on board. Sir?
But the idea of a federal system where states have powers to do different things, with the Privileges and Immunities Clause, brings up all these ideas that you recognize my marriage, but they don't, that state doesn't. What do you mean I'm not married in your state? Or abortion.
Yep.
That's a great way to keep abortion in perpetual limbo, is to say, is to put it in this place where it's up to each state. Well, no, but wait a minute, this is real fundamental.
Yeah.
This is a real fundamental thing that kind of, or the right to vote,
Sure, yeah.
laws in the South.
Absolutely.
Kind of thing.
Yeah, so I think there are kind of two approaches to that, and I think the issues that you raise 2 slightly different issues. One, and I'm sort of surprised that the courts didn't do much with this, although they rarely rule on full faith and credit kind of stuff. But the Defense of Marriage Act, if you were to take the full faith and credit clause seriously, that we recognize things from different states, the Defense of Marriage Act, which says no, you don't recognize, same-sex marriages from other states. On its face, that's blatantly unconstitutional. Something like that. Something like abortion's a little trickier. We have a Supreme Court decision that says, you can have an abortion within these parameters. But it doesn't have that same kind of, quite the same constitutional import, potentially, because it doesn't just fly in the face so obviously of a chunk, like the full faith and credit clause does, like the marriage thing did. But yeah, I think, both of those, kind of rise to that, or voting rights kind of things, et cetera. So yeah, there are some things maybe kind of implicit in that, or I'm going to roll with this anyway. Maybe there are things that ought to be universals. questions of rights, questions of certain protections, et cetera, that maybe this doesn't do a great job of protecting, when we leave them to the states. And I think you're very right that the states don't have a fantastic record sometimes of protecting these various rights. I'm going to move on real quick and just have, we've only got a few minutes left, and we're going to talk about pot for you, I promise. As far as kind of the pluses and minuses here, so on a plus side, and this would kind of turn your question or comment on its head a little bit, there might be some virtue in letting states adapt to their conditions and values. There might be some merit here on at least some things to say that, well, you should make laws that are in sync with how life functions where you are. And some of those might be value questions, although again, that's going to butt heads with universal rights kind of questions in a second. Second possibility here, this notion of states as laboratories for democracy. So from a policy standpoint, there is potentially an advantage if we let states kind of solve problems. We can see what works, and then we can other states can adopt them. So, we make policy at the federal level, you roll something out, it takes years to implement it, it takes years to see what the effects are. If it doesn't work and it's back to the drawing board, it's a long scale here. If you defer some of that stuff to the states, at least theoretically, we can have 50 solutions to the same problems that everybody has, see what works, and then, if your state did something that didn't work, you look to the ones that work. Even occasionally the national government might do things like that. I mean, that's part of the logic of the Affordable Care Act. It's largely modeled on a policy from Massachusetts that had worked reasonably well. There are legitimate questions, does this work on a national level or only in Massachusetts, because Massachusetts is its own thing. But that's kind of that logic here, is that, okay, we solve this problem in different ways. We can, go with the winners and the losers can, ditch their policies and take better ones. The other kind of theoretical here is that people might have more influence on their state and local government, and that potentially states might be less likely to abuse their citizens. Madison makes this argument. Jefferson says things like that. Jefferson had this notion that we'd all be small farmers and self-governing little commune sorts of things of some sort. On this ground that, well, if you have to look your elected people in the eye, they're not going to do bad things to their neighbors. Beyond that, you can enter politics easily enough. Most of us are not going to end up as president, but, you could get on a school board, a city council, things like that. So there's this idea that there's sort of more democracy happening at the state and local level. In terms of minuses, well, lack of uniformity can be a problem. Per your example, a question of rights. I mean, there are things, potentially civil rights, potentially abortion, potentially other things, Second Amendment rights, depending on your perspective, that perhaps, states and localities shouldn't be able to usurp. A system like this, is ripe for that kind of thing. Also from a business standpoint, if you are a business that works in all 50 states, you have potentially 50 sets of laws to comply with. Oftentimes businesses will push for national, easy, mind you, national policies, but national policies nonetheless, so that you're not in a situation where you have to make, 2 sets of Camrys, one for the U.S. and one for California or something like that, as was the case during the 80s. So that's a real challenge. If you're Target or Walmart or something like that, and you have 50 states worth of labor law to comply with and things like that, the costs of compliance go up, the chances of making a mistake go up. So that's potentially a real challenge there, as we've got this patchwork of laws. Some problems can cross state lines. Problems don't stop at the border. I think a classic example of this, anything that has kind of an economic externality to it, where, somebody else is bearing the cost of what you're doing. Acid rain is probably the best example of this. My kids were talking about this for some reason the other day, which is funny, because I haven't heard acid rain mentioned in years, except that I use it in class, because, what was happening is basically, states like here, we were pumping out sulfur dioxide, it was blowing east and falling on New York State. Well, how do you resolve that in a system where, it's largely a patchwork of state laws? We don't have any incentive to really change things because it's not our problem. The acid's falling on somebody else. Lots of things. Fireworks, those cross state lines up until, now they're legal here. But man, it's not like my neighborhood was really any quieter last summer either, because Missouri and Wisconsin aren't that far away. You can make the same argument for guns, they cross state lines all the time. So, any number of these problems, they might need kind of more of a national solution because they're not going to just stop at the border. Potentially a question of the race to the bottom. That is, states might sort of undercut policies, trying to avoid costs or attract business or things like that, and essentially kind of shut down, the ability to make policy. Welfare policy, there's the potential for that. A lot of states were concerned that, oh gosh, poor people will move to my state if we have more generous benefits than our neighbors do. Then the neighbors think this, poor people aren't that mobile. It's kind of the problem with this argument. But we used to hear this in Minnesota when I lived there all the time, is that, oh my gosh, people are going to hop on a bus from Illinois and come here because we give, $80 a month more in benefits. That was always kind of a notion to undercut, this could be true of environmental regulations, business taxes, et cetera. Kind of the Kansas experiment right now. Let's cut our taxes, try to attract business, and then suddenly we don't have any revenue left. That's a potential problem with this. You're throwing all 50 states into competition with each other, stadium deals, things like that. So there's a potential downside of that. Last couple things. Generally speaking, all that participatory mumbo jumbo, people do not participate in state politics like they ought to. In theory, your vote counts for a lot more at the state level. I'm always hesitant to say this, in an election year to my students, but, your vote for president doesn't really matter, your individual vote. No offense, but, the odds that you cast the tie-breaking vote in the tie-breaking state, it's about like getting struck by lightning while being eaten by a shark. It's just not going to happen. On the other hand, your ability to influence a city council race, to influence a school board race, I have a friend who lost a school board seat by a coin toss because it was a tie. These kinds of things really matter, but people don't show up. Cedar Falls keeps having, school board elections where 5% of the electorate shows up. So people aren't meeting that. And kind of to your point that goes along with that, states don't have a real great track record in a lot of cases of protecting rights. There's this logic that they will, but all your Jim Crow laws, your segregation, your slavery, that's all state level stuff. I grew up in Illinois. We have, 2 governors in jail right now, I think. Illinois is not good at doing anything. They just lost the lottery, in fact, because they can't pay their bills. So at any rate, states don't always do a better job than the national government does of a lot of these things. All right, with the negative minute and a half that we have left, just quickly, so marijuana, as you pointed out, this in a lot of ways is sort of the big test case now for questions of federalism. For a long time, in my intro class, this was on my list of banned paper topics. Basically, I have a really easy assignment, pick an issue, it's got 2 sides, write about it, try to sell it. And what I found was that lots of students, for some reason, wanted to write about pot, go figure, and that the papers were uniformly terrible. Across the board. Although they had great moments. I mean, my favorite was the one that started out, I'm not going to lie, I like smoking weed. Which I said, please, I don't need to know this. At any rate, that was on my banned list for years until, as you point out, lots of states have set up a really interesting federalism question here. So, at the national level, marijuana is illegal. It's a Schedule II drug, I think it is. But over the past 20 years or so, we've had states that have essentially decriminalized, legalized for medical purposes in the state of California, for example, and others, and legalized totally in the case of Colorado and Washington and a couple other states, I think, at this point. This sets up a giant question of federalism, because essentially you are governed by 2 different sets of laws. And this sets up all kinds of challenges for people sort of in those states. How do we deal with this issue? Because, the state of Colorado can say, hey, you can run a dispensary and, there's an age limit, I think. Is it 21 or I don't know. But within kind of our state parameters, anybody can get pot that wants to get pot, and you can sell it, and you're not going to get in trouble. Well, you can get in lots of trouble for doing that at the national level. And how do we resolve this? It led to all kinds of interesting questions. One problem in Colorado that nobody had anticipated was how do you deal with the money? Because no bank wanted to touch drug money, because they're all federally regulated. And so so you basically had these pot dispensaries that would have a safe with, $500,000 in small bills in it, because nobody would take their cash. That's suddenly a public safety issue. You have large quantities of cash sitting around. That's just asking for, armed robberies and things like that.
But I found great irony in the fact that they figured out a way to tax it.
Yeah, there you go. So, well, and that's always, I'm always amused when people get, in trouble for pot at the federal level. It's always for not having the tax stamp that the federal government won't give you. So it's a catch-22 kind of situation there. As far as how we've dealt with it so far, and this is an issue that I promise is headed to the Supreme Court one of these days, because it's just an untenable situation right now where you have these two sets of laws. Basically, the Obama administration flat out said, we're just not going to enforce it in states that have legalized. And, lots of people cheered, and I kind of said, there's going to be a Republican president one of these days, and then let's see what happens. And lo and behold, I know a thing or two about a thing or two. And that's what happens. Attorney General Sessions largely wants to bring back the war on drugs as we know it from the 80s. Guess we'll send kids to DARE again or whatever. But he's basically said he's going to crack down. And he's asked Congress for money to crack down. And I think that's what's going to set up a conflict here. Ultimately is, somebody in Colorado is going to get busted by the feds and is going to appeal this to the Supreme Court. I don't know what they're going to do. I mean, arguably, probably the federal government has standing here, would be my sense, based on a lot of stuff I don't have time to go into at the moment. But based on our sort of understanding of federal regulation of commerce, probably the feds win. That combined with the Supremacy Clause, probably wins. I mean, for a variety of reasons. The other issue that's come up here is one of interstate conflict. So this was kind of a small footnote, but Nebraska and I believe Kansas both sued Colorado because they had increased law enforcement expenses from people bringing pot back into their states. Supreme Court threw that out. They didn't they didn't throw it out, but they wouldn't take the case and left it back to the previous judge that said, no, you don't have the ability to sue these guys over that sort of thing. But this does get into that concept that we talked about a minute ago, which is that, when we have states doing different things, it's not exactly hard to take, pot from Colorado into another state, or a gun from Missouri into Illinois, or, what have you. That sets up this sort of conflict as well, is that, lots of... I have some real questions. I mean, I've been through western Nebraska. I'm not sure how many people are in western Nebraska to buy pot from Colorado and, drive up costs. But certainly, we get concerns like that. So again, this is kind of a microcosm of that. And again, this question of who should have power. For a lot of folks on this question, it's largely a question of what you want to do with the issue. Which I think oftentimes for the public, these questions of federalism, people will stake out these really strong stands until it gets them policy that they don't like. If you've noticed on this issue, Democrats are typically the national government party and Republicans typically the states' rights kind of party, unless it's pot. Then suddenly Democrats have this great case to make about, states' rights all the way, and Republicans are like, no, this is a federal problem. So I'm not sure that the public stands on these, and we could pick other issues, but this has been one that for me has been really cute to watch the public flip in their traditional partisan ways, because... that's kind of contra to where the parties typically stand on these issues. But I think a lot of times people, at least in the public, frankly the state government too, I think are pushing largely for outcomes that they like as much as standing on any particular principle about this. All right, well, I've run now 5 or 6 minutes over. Just to sum up real quick. So again, what we have here is sort of this question of division. And I think this is, of the things that sort of animate the constitutional system, it's one that is a really important arrangement here. I think, it's got historical impact. Hopefully we've demonstrated it has, some real life contemporary implications today. There are, of course, some disputes of effectiveness. You could argue, and certainly if you're a conservative, a lot of this notion of keeping the size of the federal government in check, it didn't work so well. Would be, that's one kind of con that we didn't get in there. But yeah, the national government has become more powerful. It has come to some extent at the expense of the states. On the other hand, per kind of your comment earlier, hey, the best argument for this is that it's still here, and it's worked reasonably well in that regard. And of course, it sets up these potential challenges where the rubber meets the road. So, anyway, thanks for having me today. It's been a pleasure talking with you guys, and I'll see you again tomorrow, actually. So, take care. Thanks. Oh, I'd love to know, actually.